So, for instance, with James Ellroy, the crime writer that I've made a big film about, he takes crimes, real crimes, that somehow in the public mind aren't necessarily solved. And he creates a fictional solution to them. For instance, the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And by the time you end reading it, you feel you've lived through it and you know what killed Kennedy. It doesn't matter who killed Kennedy anymore.
Yeah.
And you've traveled through the whole social complex that gave rise to the sort of forces that killed an American president, and in fact created a pivot in American history. But the information doesn't matter. Many of the characters are real people, and many of the characters he's fictionalized for the purposes of dramatizing what he's trying to get to. But at the end of the book, you feel you've discovered truth, not facts. So I made the film about James Ellroy because I was interested in what an artist can achieve that's different from what a detective can achieve or a journalist. And so the film underneath it has this idea, which is what's the difference between truth and fact. And all of my films have a sort of metaphysical idea underneath them. Garry Kasparov playing IBM is kind of a rumination, not on artificial intelligence, because the fact is IBM's supercomputer Deep Blue was not using artificial intelligence. It was using brute force calculation. Now artificial intelligence has solved the chess problem. But then it merely had to be able to run through more permutations and see where they would take you. And for that, you need an extraordinary set of processes.
Yeah.
But it still didn't play as good chess as Kasparov. Kasparov, the team around the IBM computer found a way to drive Kasparov crazy away from the computer.
Yeah.
And the film is largely about his growing paranoia and him losing his grip as a chess player, the greatest chess player of all time, who is so far beyond any previous chess player that I would watch him, and he was 14 moves ahead. He could see. Most grandmasters and champions that I've met can see 8 moves ahead.
Whoa.
And what's more, he was undistracted by any piece that wasn't relevant. He had a kind of, apart from having a genius mind, he also had an extraordinary pattern recognition. He'd look at the pieces and he'd see their potential.
Okay.
So he was seeing a dynamic thing in a still picture. He was seeing, like I was saying to you about at the beginning, the wheat field, as opposed to a painting of a wheat field, you know?
Yeah.
But he falls up, they really perform a psychological jujitsu on him. Oh. And I think he wanted to do the film with me because he thought I would be able to prove that they had cheated by having grandmasters secretly driving the computer, an entire team of them.
Yeah.
Well, they did to some extent, but that wasn't what won. What won was that they made him crazy.
Yeah.
And so what I became interested in was the concept of a human interacting with a machine and the psychological ramifications of it. Also, I was interested in something else, and Kasparov delivers this very well. In Gary's view, he was one of the things that brought down the old communist regime. That he fought the Soviet Stalinist chess machine.
Yeah.
They tried to stop him being, he's Armenian, he's Jewish, all the things that don't play well in Moscow.
Yeah.
And at 20 or so, he emerged this beast who beats everything in front of him. And he, because of the timing of history, feels that he was part of bringing down the vestiges of Stalinism that brought in the new Russia. And what the film is also about is he could beat Stalin, but he couldn't beat Wall Street. Because IBM had, when the match began, IBM was seen as yesterday's company.
Yeah.
Engineers weren't going to IBM to work on their computers. Their computers were seen more as office equipment rather than anything to do with the cutting edge. Not like Apple. you know.
Yeah.
And the day that Kasparov lost, their share value went up $2 billion.
Whoa.
And suddenly IBM was a darling of brilliant young electronic engineers and computer scientists coming out of universities and graduate schools. It was an extraordinary piece of corporate strategy. So it was very lucky for them, because I was never able to find the internal document by which they planned to do this. It was lucky they won, but $2 billion in one day, their share value went up because they beat Kasparov, which tells you how significant Kasparov is.
Yeah.
And so ultimately the film says you can beat Stalin, but you can't beat Wall Street.
Whoa.
And because there's 2 billion people who play chess on Earth, it's been seen by every chess player on Earth, this film. And I'm very proud of it, because I took it on partly to see, can you make a film about chess that won't be like watching paint dry?
Yeah.
And yeah, go on.
No. I think the other aspect that interested people besides the ones who follow chess is the aspect whether whether the machine will conquer humans at the end of it all. So I think that's another aspect that this film of yours touches upon.
Yeah, that's also, I mean, I use a bit of a news clip at one point when he loses, and the newscaster says, "Is this the end for mankind? Kasparov lost to them, and he looks very sad." And then he says, "And now the weather." He just beats the audience.
Yeah, I like that cut. I like that cut a lot. Because that's what happens even with news and all, is that what I've seen is that 2 or 3 days they show the big breaking news, and then they move on to whatever is the breaking news the next day. Yeah. So what about this aspect, the man versus machine? This aspect, do you think there is do you have an opinion on this? Whether machine will win, or will humans always find a way to get around whatever challenges the machines throw up? How will this? What's the end to this debate? That's what I want to know.
Well, I think I don't really have a sort of science fiction sense of machines taking over, but I do feel that as technologies become more sophisticated, we are entering into a period of surveillance culture. Whether it's the Chinese for security purposes, or whether it's Amazon's for, we are now in the era of surveillance capitalism, and quite soon we'll be fully in the era of surveillance social control, government control. So I think the real problem with technology is that in the hands of people with malign intent or exploitative intent, it makes them more and more successful at what they do. And it's not easy to find the mechanisms to resist.
So you talked about this movie that you made, James Ellroy's Feast of Death. I think this was the documentary that you made. So what I want to know is that there's this with people who write crime novels, or crime stories, or people who make fiction films with violence and all. One aspect is that they are they have those violent elements in them. So I saw clips of your film, and that's exactly what he and in fact his wife were talking about, that my writing is another part of my life, and my own life is something that's quite different. So is what's your take on the fact that people who create what we can call violent films, or films on crime dramas and all. So what's their psychology or thought process that you discovered with with Ellroy?
Well, I don't know that I can make a general statement about it, but I do think that artists frequently explore the darknesses they find within themselves. I think that it's hard to write convincingly about a sociopath without having some instinct for how that would feel to be. I think that all of us have got various themes running through our lives, whether they're psychological or from damage we've taken or things we're interested in. And I think, just as I said to you earlier, most of my films, like the film I made in Mustique about the man who owned the island of Mustique, friend of Margaret, Colin Tennant, Lord Glenconner. To me, my sister said to me, you made that film about our father. I mean, so I think that whether I intended or not, I've done a series of films driven by my own psychological forces.
Yeah. Mm.
I think, though, that there's something else that happens with crime novels. I think that, in general, the good ones are about, they use a crime as a lens to anatomize the society within which the crime happened.
Yeah.
What happens is society is disrupted by this act of violence. And then the detective comes in and works towards finding something, a solution that reorders society back into a stable way.
Yeah.
But in the course of that, we find out so many of the pathologies of our society, not merely the criminal pathologies, but the social ones, the commercial ones, the financial ones, the gender roles and stuff like that. So I think the best crime fiction is really merely a device to understand our society, which is what I think American Tabloid by James Ellroy does. Unfortunately, too many crime novels and television and movies involve almost cosmetic, glamorized violence against women.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I went to Ellroy, who I really find an awful person. Most of the films I make about people, after I've made them, I never want to see them again. They suck all the oxygen out of the room. They often order for you in restaurants. And you know, they're very successful, so they think that they've got the right to be as abusive as whatever. But no, as soon as I've finished with them all, I try never to have anything to do with them again. What it is they're so different from me that I want to find out what it feels like to be them. I want to find out what it's like to look through their eyes. But I don't want to be friends afterwards. I so don't need it. But despite my feeling extremely negative about Ellroy, what I found with his violence about women, and his books are full of extraordinary violence, graphic, complex violence against women. He does something different where, to some extent, he's an actual moralist, because the way he writes the violence against the women is not just glamorous, femjet plot device. It's not aesthetic. It is so brutal that you were saying how the news moves on to something else 3 or 4 days later. I think that a lot of crime fiction, a lot of violent information inures us. It makes us a little bit insensitive, numb about things. And what his prose does, it keeps ripping the scar tissue open. It's so extreme that you can never think. You can't be left enjoying the fact that a gorgeous woman had her breast cut off. You know, it's not the gorgeousness that matters, which it does in most crime fiction, because it's prurient. It's sort of kill pornography. But in his case, it's actually what the violence really is, which is just violence. And he won't let you forget that. So to that extent, I have something positive to say about him. And that's the other reason I did it, because I thought this guy writes extreme stuff, which people who weren't sensitive to what he's actually doing would ban from libraries. They would ban, you know, because it's extremely violent. But actually what he's doing, he's taking you somewhere so that your attitude to violence against women shifts. You can no longer, after reading Ellroy, tolerate it as an aesthetic plot device in other people's writing.
So, I completely understand that. It'll take me a couple of seconds to get out of
Sorry.
that. But okay. So, moving on to another film of yours that talks about another aspect, and which is really dealing with the physical hurdles that you face, and that is Snowblind. So Snowblind is one I really want you to talk about. I really want you to talk about that film. How what inspired you to make that film, and how was the whole experience of making Snowblind?
Well, a film won an Oscar uh, called March of the Penguins,
Yep.
uh, and it was a wonderful film. And they managed to find a way of filming the penguins in Antarctica during tremendously terrible weather conditions, um, in a way that told a story. It wasn't information; it was narrative, and I thought it was a fabulous film. And then Herzog, who I know a bit, Werner Herzog, he made a film called Grizzly Man, which everybody thought should have won the Oscar that year. And Grizzly Man's about a guy who's in love with grizzly bears and tries to live among them, and they eat him. And they eat him while the camera's running.
Oh my.
It's very noisy. And Herzog doesn't show the footage in the film, but he plays the audio of the footage, and he sits there listening to it. And I thought, gosh, I just turned 50, and I thought, no one's ever going to ask, because I'm thought of as an intellectual filmmaker, and a sort of dramatist or whatever, but no one ever would ask me to do a film in bad weather. No one ever. And I've had a very physically adventurous life, and much of my time in LA, 34 years, was spent in the desert or in the mountains. I mean, I prided myself on my outdoorsness and my toughness. And yet the kind of films I made are so, although they're action films, you can tell someone's thinking as well who's making the film. So
Yeah.
that typecast you. And I thought, and I said to somebody, I said, look, no one's ever going to ask me to do a bad weather film. And I got a call like the next day
Oh wow.
from Discovery Channel saying, do you want to do a film in Alaska? And I said, as long as it's in midwinter.
Oh.
And they told me that there was this girl who was blind, whose ambition in life was to race in a race which is called the hardest race on Earth. It's 1,100 miles, mostly above the Arctic Circle in midwinter, where about 100 people have dog sleds. And that's a snow sled pulled by 16 husky dogs. And it's 1,100 miles. So in the beginning, when they began it, sometimes it would take 2 months. But with improved technology and so on and so forth, it got down to about 2 weeks. And then in the last 20 years, it's been much faster than that. And all she ever wanted to do was race in it. But she's blind, so they won't let her. So she filed a lawsuit with the Protection of Disabilities Act or something in America, and they were forced to let her race. And they asked me if I would film it. I wasn't going to, because I didn't want to do disability porn. But then they sent me some footage of her where she's racing along and the dogs see a tree coming and they swerve and the sled hits the tree and she bounces out of it and falls on the ground, and then she jumps up again with her nose bleeding and goes, yes! And I thought, wow, that girl's got spirit. So I thought she'd be a good character. So I agreed to do the film. It was a fantastically expensive film. I had 5 camera units. I had a helicopter. I had a plane that could land in snow. It had. I had 2 snow machines, meaning those big bikes that snowmobiles, but big industrial ones. And I also, from the BBC, this was for Discovery Channel, but from the BBC Camera Lab, they made me tiny little cameras that you could put both on her headband and on the dog's, so that I could get to see what the dogs saw.
So, but there was an accident you told me about that you experienced while you had an accident while making this film. Would you like to tell about that? Or
I didn't have the accident because the weather was so bad that the helicopter thought there was a high risk of us crashing during a big storm in the middle of the Alaska range. The storm was so bad, the winds were over 100 miles an hour, that the American Federal Aviation Authority had shut down the Alaska range. No air flights were allowed, but we were already in the air, and so was my say. But the camera helicopter put me down at one of our supply dumps. Every 70 miles, we had built a little station where we could refuel the helicopter because they don't have that much. And also where, sorry. Sorry.
I think the Arctic weather got to you.
Just remembering it gets to me. The thing is that cold. I don't know. Do you guys in India now think in centigrade or in Fahrenheit?
Centigrade, Celsius. Yeah, that's how it is.
So minus 40 was the average temperature.
Oh my God.
At one point, it went down to minus 60 in a place called Cripple. I think was it called Cripple? Yeah. And the thing about that kind of cold, when you're walking in it, it pulls you down into the snow. You actually feel as if there's this hand coming up through the and everything is white. You can't, you're snowblind, and you feel these claws coming up to pull you down, and you know as you get tired so quickly that if you lie down just for a break, you'll never wake up.
Yeah,
and there's a kind of purity to that. It's really an extraordinary, austere, aesthetic, and spiritual experience to be in an environment that cold. I mean, imagine it's like being on Mercury on the far side of it or something. I gloried in it. But the other thing is I have diabetes, and your body burns through its available fuel much faster when it's cold if you're diabetic. Well, actually, whatever you are. So one of the ways my diabetes then would express itself would be if I ran out of blood sugar to burn, I'd get confused. I couldn't make decisions, and I couldn't remember to do what I needed to do. So all my crew were carrying glucose tablets in case I got goofy. And we had this rule that you always had to have two other of your team in view, so that if anything happened, you'd be in a triangulated thing. And if you were just two of you, you'd have to stop until it regrouped. So the helicopter dropped me at one of our refueling dumps, and it then flew back over the canyon, the gorge that the girl was going through, and a gust of wind slapped it against the side of this. So the camera is running as the helicopter is plummeting down, and it's right on top of the girl. So, and she hears the sound, and she looks up. She hears a helicopter's engine failing and screaming and coming straight at her. It hit at 15 feet above her, it hit a ledge.
Oh.
And it ended up being balanced on the ledge like that.
Okay.
And there's a movie called Bullet, or a Steve McQueen movie, or the other one, The Italian Job. One of them ends up with a car on a cliff, and all the money, all the gold is in that side of the car that they've stolen, right? In my case, all the footage was in that side of the helicopter. And I had to hire a couple of Eskimos to secure the helicopter with ropes so I could get my footage out before the Federal Aviation Authority was able to confiscate it, because as evidence about what caused the crash, which it wouldn't have helped them with anyway. But before that, it was a difficult day all told, because before that, it was after that. The helicopter had gone. The plane, which had picked me up, was taking me to a lake called Desolation Lake. Yeah. And all the lakes are frozen. And where they knew there was a lodge which we could take shelter in during this weather. And as we were taxiing in, we hit the lake and started taxiing, and another plane came down and hit the lodge, and its wings flew off. I mean, it was altogether a difficult time. You're going to a lodge for safety, and a plane hits it, you know. And so there's only one. The girl only had one camera. So both one of the snow machines had fallen into a crevice, 18 feet deep or something, or sorry, 9 feet deep, and it took them 18 hours to get out. And the other snow machine was trying to help them. The helicopter had crashed. The plane was stuck at this lodge. And so the only camera that was working was the girl's head camera.
Oh.
And one of her dogs dies as they're racing through the ice.
Oh my God.
And she can't tell visually, obviously, but something has gone wrong. She could feel it dragging the team. And she stumbles along, and you're seeing what her head camera is seeing. She finds this dead dog tied to all the other dogs. And she starts screaming with shock, and she loves her dogs. And with the camera, you see the face of the dog being pulled up to her mouth, and she starts giving it
mouth to mouth
resuscitation. Mm-hmm. And it's really the most extraordinary footage. And you have to see the film to find out what happened. But those are sort of things where, you know, you're a filmmaker, and part of you thinks, wow, that's jackpot footage.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're a human being, and you're thinking, I can't watch this.
Yes.
And that raises a whole issue about documentaries. You know, where is the line that crosses between you being a prurient voyeur and getting to the heart of things? So yeah, that's the scene I think you're asking me about. So
yeah, and since you mentioned about your love or romanticism for failed geniuses, there's the Agony and Ecstasy of Phil Spector is and there's one aspect of the film that I really want you to I'd like you to discuss, that is the music bits that you use during the film while showing the trial. So like there's this song Dadu, Run Run Run, and all these songs. So someone who really sympathizes with Phil would like find it funny, but someone who sympathizes with maybe Lana Clarkson, who got murdered, would really find that irritating. So like you told me about your how the fact that people talked about your movies motivates you. So what was people's response when they saw this movie, this film, and yeah, any other stories regarding this film, The Agony and Ecstasy of Phil Spector?
Well, Phil Spector was the biggest and greatest music producer of the 60s, who was put out of business by the Beatles suddenly replacing his sound with theirs. And instead of just giving up, he ended up producing the last Beatles album. And he ended up producing the solo albums of 3 of the Beatles, or 2 of the Beatles. John Lennon, he produced all 3 or 4 of his post-Beatles albums, and George Harrison. And he managed to continue to be... But he was a millionaire by the time he was 17. He'd written and performed a song that went to #1, and Time magazine called him the first teenage millionaire. And because he had so much success so young, no one ever said no to him. He was already a damaged character as a teenager, but when you get to the sort of power that he had, you can behave as badly as you want because no one's going to say no to you. And he got more and more, you know, you said love. I don't love these people. I want to find out what it feels like to be them. I want to understand people who are not like me. I want to feel what they feel. And I also make my films for myself, not for the audience. I mean, I'm lucky that audiences love them. But what I'm interested in is my own personal delving into trying to remove my skin and their skin so that I can briefly have a full identity with them, and then try to express it artistically. But it's really about, I suppose, it's not that I love them, it's that maybe if we go back to my father issue, which is I can't understand what made him tick. And one day I'll find out by making my films, you know, and explain my father's personal tragedy. So with Phil, he was always a gun nut, and he'd always pull out the gun, and he tried to rape a friend of mine years ago in a hotel with a gun. And I was talking to Ringo Starr, the Beatles drummer. We were talking about doing a film together, and he used to share a back fence of his house in Beverly Hills with the back fence of where Phil Spector's house was. And Phil was always in the back, he said, firing off his guns. And he said, you know, he's a gun nut. And if you're a gun nut, one day someone's going to die. And then he said, you can't take away his music. And for me, that was the interesting thing. We have a notion of genius in our society, and we have a notion of artistic giants. And we give them all kinds of leeway in how we judge them. Meanwhile, you have a criminal justice system that ideally does not differentiate between the great, the good, the rich, the powerful, whatever, ideally. And in Phil Spector's case, there's this collision between an artistic genius and someone who might have murdered this woman. This woman died in his castle, gunshot in her mouth. And I thought that would be interesting to see the collision between the criminal justice system and I in court I would watch him, because I attended the murder trial and filmed it. In court I would watch him, and it was quite clear that he wasn't really paying attention. He was listening to his biggest hits, and he was thinking, if only the jury and the people in this courtroom could hear them, they'd just let me go. So I wanted to make a film about that paradox. I mean, it's perfect material for it. But then I found, I don't like the way most documentaries use a little bit of each song, 10 seconds, you know. I decided I would use all the songs in full. And when I arranged with him to do the film, the only promise I gave him was that I would play his song River Deep, Mountain High in full. And then I thought, you know what, I'll play them all. And some of them I played twice. You've Lost That Loving Feeling, I played twice. And River Deep, Mountain High, I played twice. But basically I have 21 of his songs. They're all average about 3 minutes. And I play them full. But then I realized that if I listened carefully to the music, I might find out what I hadn't noticed when it was on the radio and stuff, you know, the music of my youth. I might find out if there were any clues about how this guy ended up on trial for murder. And similarly, watching the murder trial, I kept thinking, I think that might explain something in one of the songs. So I decided to intercut the evidence with the music. And again, I wasn't thinking about how people would react to it. It just was me trying to see if the art and the trial somehow could explain each other. And I thought the way to do that is to juxtapose them. And then the record companies got angry. But I succeeded in my mission, which was convincing them that they would lose if they sued me. And so the film stands as is. And the music for me, it's great because you get to listen to good music. But what's even better is it becomes about something bigger than itself, you know. And also, my whole life, the two films I wish I could have made, I wish that when Napoleon was confined on the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, at the very end of all his extraordinary career, and his bestriding the known universe in his head, to be reduced to 3 small rooms on an island, a tiny island, and have no. So he's pacing back and forth, back and forth, and I always wanted to make that film.
Okay.
And that was what Phil was. He was confined in this castle during the trial. They didn't put him in jail.
Yeah, he was on house arrest. Yeah.
He was on. But to me it was, and he's also short like Napoleon. He's like 4 foot.
Yeah.
And I just thought, this is my film, Napoleon on St. Helena. This guy confined to. And the other film that I would never have a chance to make was Oscar Wilde, the playwright and public figure and homosexual, who his trial was the defining great collision between an artistic genius and the criminal justice, and he completely got it wrong. And I wish I could have filmed that trial, celebrating his genius and analyzing how he managed, by being himself in court, playing for laughs, to alienate the judge so much that he had to go to jail. And I couldn't make either of those films. And in Phil Spector, both of those became an opportunity.
Okay, fine. That's interesting to know. And so another thing that I've noticed with many of your movies, many of your films, is the fact that you do the narration, the voiceover yourself, or do you get it done by other people as well?
I usually do it myself because they're very personal to me. History Channel, when I did my big film about Lincoln and his depressions, President Lincoln's middle of the 19th century depression, which I was interested in as a clinical thing. There they imposed on me someone who they thought sounded like Lincoln, and he didn't. No, in general, I do it myself just because I don't. If you're going to get someone in who does it, it'll generally be an actor with a career, and they'll have their own opinions, and they'll read lines differently from how I want. And I prefer to have complete control over my material. So.
Okay, that is the reason. And you always talk about music, the use of music in your film. So how do you go about the music process? Is it do you first take the footage and then you get in touch with people who make original, like the musicians who come up with the kind of music that you want, or is it using stock music? How do you come up with music?
Well, some of my films, which are in the realm of popular culture, I simply get the rights to hit songs that I think are relevant. Whether it's the Phil Spector thing, or I did a film about Uri Geller, the bent spoons and stuff. And this was a film about his life as a psychic operative for the CIA and the British Ministry of Defense. They paid him $40 million over 40 years to do things like, with his brain, find Osama bin Laden. And it's such a great con job that he actually took the Pentagon for $40 million. So I want to make a comedy about that. But then I realized I didn't want people to think I believed anything that he said or did.
Okay.
So I deliberately made a soundtrack of using all the music from sort of spoof spy television series and movies, like Austin Powers. I used the Austin Powers theme. So whenever he comes up with a really big lie, you hear the Austin Powers music. And so that was so that audiences wouldn't mistake me as a believer. But generally, when I've got one of my big psychodramas, I have he's a very well-known British composer for television and movies. And what happens is, I think of a movie. I mean, I plan to make a film. And what you have is you have a feeling for the film. So I'll talk to him before I've shot anything about the feeling. And he'll give me 20 tracks to listen to from other people.
Okay.
To see what kind of sound I felt goes with the feeling.
Okay.
And then he would compose pastiches of those as I'm cutting the film, so that I could play them in embryo against it, and that would often help me work out what my scene was about. And then when I finished my cut, he would do his final version with his own compositions and stuff. It's a mutual process where both of us take each other somewhere that we wouldn't go on our own. And his music is very narrative. Like in the James Ellroy film, the music he does kind of takes your eye to the part of the screen that you should be looking at in a complex frame. Same with the Kasparov film, same with Lincoln. His music is narrative driven. I mean, he's a big classical and modern music composer, but more than anyone I've ever worked with, he writes music that helps you tell your story, as opposed to tells the audience what to feel. A lot of music is like wallpaper and lazy filmmaking. His is a proactive, narrative, dramatic component, and we work very closely together from before I shot the film at all.
Oh, so that's a great thing that you consider music such an important, integral part of the filmmaking that you work on the music even before shooting the footage. So that's a great thing. That is
Yeah,
great
I think in the masterclass that I showed you, I think we've got footage of Kasparov playing a game against Karpov. There's no words, but the music takes you through this action and makes you understand what really is going on.
Yeah,
I saw that. I think that's an extraordinary achievement for a musician to have done. My work is very collaborative. I mean, like with the James Ellroy film, there was a day where I just couldn't face Ellroy, and we were up in Fargo, in the frozen northern end of America, and I was so depressed I just couldn't bear it. And my camera woman, Mary Salberti, who's a genius, she said, "Are you coming down?" I said, "No, I'm going to stay in bed all day. I just can't face it." And she said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know, do whatever you want." And she said, "Well, I'm going to go out and film." And she went and filmed all day, and she came back and she triumphantly said to me, "I think I have the final scene. I think I shot the final image you're going to want to leave your audience with." And I thought, yeah, right. When we processed all the film and when we sat in the lab and started editing, she was right. That's the final scene. And all my people, and I have a stable of people who work with me again and again. All of them know they have, I mean, I make the decisions, but they have no hesitation to suggest and to do things on their own. Because I think the joy of a collaborative process like filmmaking is that if you allow the talent around you to feel it's also theirs, they have contributions that you would never have thought of on your own, and your film gets better and better. So I try to work without ego.
It's about giving them a sense of ownership. Yeah,
and it really makes a difference.
Yeah,
and then they work with you again and again. I mean, I've got editors who have worked with me again and again, said no to other work because I have another rule, which is I never ask them to work after 6 in the evening, because so much of the editing world is about pulling an all-nighter and staying up all night to get a scene right. I don't think you make good decisions at 1 in the morning. So so they all have like normal home lives when they're making a film with me.
That's a great thing. That's a great thing for a producer, a filmmaker. If you get a producer or a director like that, that's a great thing for the crew.
Yeah, you've got to make them, and that way they will follow me to the ends of the earth. I mean, when we were shooting the Ori film, one day we had to shoot in 3 different cities that were several hours apart by airplane, and we had to sleep in I have a club that I'm a member of in New York. We all had to sleep on armchairs there because there was no chance, because we needed to take a late night overnight flight to get to the next location, and only because they know I really care. And I always make sure we eat well and stuff like that. They put up with that, where normal people would have just said no. I mean, we were all blind by the end of 3 days of this, but we got the footage and we still loved each other. So
great thing. Yeah, but if the general, what you're trying to say is, if you're mostly if you care for your crew, they'll always take care of these small or make small sacrifices that they'll do on their own. That's I think what you're trying to say. And
without hierarchy, I mean, yes, there is a boss, but it's a consensual process.
Yeah, it is teamwork. So you have taken kind of a backseat in the last few years. You're not making as many films or documentaries as you used to before. So what is the next like big project that you're working? Is there anything that you're working on, or nothing? Um, um, no big project that you're working on right now.
I had a quadruple bypass 4 years ago.
Yep.
Had a major heart attack, and I was just finishing a double-barreled epic with an actor called Andy Serkis, who is best known as Gollum in The Lord of the Rings and as Caesar the chimp in all the Planet of the Apes series. I mean, he's an extraordinary actor at creating creatures that he acts. And I was doing this epic about Neanderthals, using him, his studio, and his team to bring to life this extinct version of humans. And just when I finally finished getting the cut I wanted, I dropped with this heart attack. And my wife, who ran the drama for the BBC for many years, and now runs a big production company for drama. So she doesn't need me to work. She decided I should not direct anymore because, as you get a hint of, I like extreme filmmaking, and the people I work with that I film are really difficult. And she felt that it would be too hard for me. I don't necessarily agree, but she's usually right, so I've stopped directing. I'm setting up a film school within my old high school. I do that a bit. It's a sort of 6-year plan, and eventually we'll be turning out teenagers who are as good as filmmakers as my graduate students, both at University of Southern California, where I helped set up an MA program there, and University College London, where I in the 2010 began helping set up an MA program there. But now I've got 13 to 17-year-olds, and I believe I can get them to leave the high school with the same skill set and narrative filmmaking, storytelling skills of my graduate students. So that's a nice little project. But I am developing a 3-part documentary series, which I'll produce about the end of the British Empire, how it ended, and the extraordinary amount of violence that was unleashed was the consequence of how things grew. And whether it's in India or in Palestine or in, the tremendous amount, and the fantasy that the British have is that it was very civilized, the way they civilized these peoples and then quietly withdrew. It was brutal. Not just the million who died on the trains at midnight's hour in India, but Burma. I mean, it's just an extraordinary amount. Kenya, and I don't think we can actually understand colonialism or the empire, the British Empire, and the extent to which it still shapes the world. And England has this fantasy that they're still and is shaping the catastrophe of the way the Enlightenment is ending in the West. And a lot of that is fueled by the nature of the British Empire and the nature of the damage it did, not just when it was up and running, but in its leaving. So it's a 3-part series. The first episode, and it's being written and performed by, fronted by an extraordinary Harvard historian who won a Pulitzer Prize for her doctoral dissertation, which was about the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, which was nothing like what you're taught at schools. And she found all the first-hand evidence of what actually happened. So I think that way I could at least have made one serious film in my life. I was working with the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown for 3 years to do that as my next film, a film about global inequality with him when I had my heart attack. So I had to let that one go. So I still want I want to do one serious political social film. I've never done anything that serious, and this way I'll feel if I can make this one happen, 3 hours of television, then I feel more satisfied about the end of my career.
Are you producing it with BBC, or like will it be released digitally or theatrically? How and when can we expect to see it?
Well, I haven't started yet. I've just been developing it with Professor Caroline Elkins, and I don't think I'll even go out with it for a broadcaster until the spring. I imagine it will take 3.5 years.
Okay.
And it's interesting because there is at the moment globally a collective intellectual revision about the understanding of empire, the ending of the American empire, the development of the Chinese empire. It's a good moment for us to understand more clearly what empires do.
That's a great thing. Yeah, I think the timing is great. And just one last thing I'd
Yeah, we should wrap it up soon because I should have stopped about an hour ago, but keep going.
And so just one last thing is there are many independent filmmakers these days, whether in India, in the US, the UK, who want to really make their kind of cinema, their kind of movie. So, what would be your advice to young budding filmmakers who don't have any resources or don't have any idea about where, the schools and the universities they can study from? It's just a passion that they have. So, what would be your suggestion, advice to budding filmmakers?
Well, when I was at the University of Southern California in a joint thing between the cinema school and the anthropology department, parents would often come to me and ask if I could help their kid get into the film school because, the building is called the Spielberg Building. Lucas went there. All the new wave then of incredibly, they all had some connection with USC. So it's a major, and because it's in LA, it feeds straight into the agents and into the studios and stuff. And I would say to them, don't, you'll send your kid to USC. You'll spend $300,000. And at the end, there's only a small chance that he or she will have actually made a film because of the way it was structured. If you want your kid to be a filmmaker as opposed to an industry manager in film, in those days it was film. So you'd have to spend about $50,000 to get all the equipment you need to make it. I'd say instead of spending $300,000 at the school, spend $50,000, buy them filmmaking equipment. And if they're going to be filmmakers, they'll make films. They'll get their friends to act in it. They'll do that. I said, you can't stop a filmmaker if they have the means of making films near them. Mm-hmm. So I'm not a big believer in film school. Now the joy is that anyone with a phone can make a movie. Yep. And the kids I'm teaching at my high school, the rule is they can only use their phones.
Oh, wow.
And they might edit on an iPad or a laptop, but some of them are editing on their phones. I don't want the technology to become the story. I want the narrative skills, the filmic storytelling, as opposed to film technology or film equipment or whatever. And what's so wonderful for young people today is they can make a film with their phone. So my advice is just make films. Watch lots of things that you like. Steal things from them. I mean, there's shots in all my films that I've seen in another film and thought, wow, that's such a cool shot. I'll use that. Okay. See what you like, and then you'll start out being imitative. Or unless you're a born genius, but generally you'll have influences. And the key thing I would say is make sure it's a story. And keep doing it. And the thing is now, because of the internet, like you with YouTube, there are so many platforms for getting discovered on. And then at some point you reach a point where you can call up Netflix and say, I did this and this and this, they'll know about it. What about this? That's my only advice. Develop it organically.
Okay.
Maybe a few kids can go to Bombay and get a job, but I think You want control of what you do. Make films that you want to make. And if you're any good, it'll get found. But by then you'll be able to say no to bullshit. Like I've final cut on all my films, right? So but that's only because, you know, first of all, I was never up for agreeing to anything anybody said. Because the other clue is I would always have a film in my head and I would be watching it. The way I would make my films would be I'd watch the film in my head and then try to get those shots.
Oh.
So imagine the film that you want is on TV and you're watching it, and make that film. So that's my only advice. So
I think that's good advice, and I'm sure it'll inspire many people. So thank you so much for the time. Thanks for all these great stories, and it was lovely talking to you. And all the best for your project on the British Empire. And I hope we connect soon. And really looking forward to your next projects, your upcoming projects.
thank you, Karthi, and thanks for having me. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks so much.